Hello, everybody. Welcome to another podcast. Well, I'm very excited today because I have a very special guest who is both a professional acquaintance and a personal acquaintance. And we're really excited today to talk about something that is near and dear to both of our hearts, but for different reasons and coming from a completely different perspective. And um, just so everybody knows who I am, my name is John Miziolek. I am a brand strategist and marketing consultant and have been in the CPG industry in particular for the last 25 plus years. But put that all aside, I am a voracious consumer of information and very curious individual. So what's happening on the world stage is very important to me. I consume data at a very, very fast rate. And the world has changed since the last four, the last eight, the last 10 years. And the information that everyone is getting is coming at a different rate. It's coming from different people. And I think there's just a general concern about the validity of a lot of the stories that we're hearing. And I'll turn it over to my co-host now, who will speak a little bit about himself. And then we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the war in Ukraine. And we're going to theme this with the five W's, the who, what, where, when, and why, which has a spider web attached to each one of the W's. And we're going to dig as deep as we can. And my friend Kirill here, who's about to talk about himself, brings a completely different perspective than what people watching or listening to this may have heard or may think they know about what's going on in the world. So, Kirill, over to you.
Thank you, John. That was very nice. So my name is Kirill Tikhomirov. I am a CPG executive like John, and I'm also a mathematician and history buff. So this gives a very interesting perspective. The whole situation globally right now and related to the war in Ukraine could be analyzed from many perspectives. And you heard a lot of that, but I'm going to provide you with my perspective. So let me tell you why I guess it might be different. So I grew up in came of age in the former Soviet Union. Um, Due to a specific way of education and some familiar of family background, I was exposed early on to the international negotiations, overall history, Slavic history, or Eastern Slavic rather history, philosophy, ideology, nuclear weapons. My first degree is from what is now called Nuclear Research University. So we had a little bit of that angle. So I was very much interested in the latest Russian imperial years and the Civil War that ended the Russian Empire and the World War II, but mostly from the Eastern Front perspective, obviously. Disarmament negotiations was part of that, but that was obviously related to the late ages. So, I guess the other important piece is that I spent half of my life on one continent and the other half of my life on this continent. So that gives, I look at myself as a little bit of a bridge of misunderstanding or understanding what's going on. So that's pretty much, I guess, some background that might be helpful for the listeners and viewers to understand.
Sure. Why don't we start with the most obvious W, I think, of them all, which also has a spider web, like I said, attached to it. But why did Putin do this? And I know that's not a simple answer. It's not simply he did this because of one, two, and three. But why did he invade Ukraine when he did? I mean, this war has been going on now since February 24th, I believe, of 2022. So we're approaching the 3-year anniversary of something that at the time in the media they were saying was going to take 1 to 2 weeks because they thought, or were at least telling people that Putin's going to go in and completely decimate Ukraine and take whatever it is that he wanted from Ukraine. And now we're going on 3 years. So this is not a small difference in the length of the conflict or in potentially what his ultimate goals are, which I'm not sure anybody really knows, but I am very curious about your perspective on that.
So I guess that's a great start, but and I said yes, but I didn't really mean that in the way that confirming what you're saying. This Russo-Ukrainian war that started with the in February of 2022 is a continuation war. Originally, it started in 2014 with the conflict in the East Ukraine, where and annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation at that point of time. So the annexation of Crimea took probably a month, and everybody knew about it. And there was later conflict that people were aware of, but it was really bloody in the first several months. Then it was, I guess, more quiet in recent years, and then the invasion happened in 2022. So, I guess to answer your question, the best way to do it, and your question is why did he do it? The question is twofold. Why did he do it, period, and why did he do it when he did it? So the last the answer to the last question is relatively straightforward. He did it because he believed that he was ready to do it. He was ready to do it militarily, politically, ideologically. Obviously, he's not a young man, so that consideration should be probably part of his calculations. That will be about the timing. We can talk about specifics. What does it mean? Ready. But ideologically, I think this war was contemplated, or rather not the war, but the whole policy was contemplated many years ago. So as Karl von Clausewitz said, war is politics by another means. So the root of the conflict is not now, right? The root of the conflict is based on overall, you can call it imperial idea of the Russia. And we're not talking about Soviet Union right now. We're talking about probably Eastern Slavic states, maybe some other territories adjacent to on the east of the country. But we are not talking about USSR. I do not believe that Putin in any shape or form is trying to restore the former USSR. That's just absolutely bogus idea. Is he trying to restore imperial Russia? Not really, from the perspective of the imperial might, but or imperial structure of the state. But maybe he's trying to assert himself and to become a great power again. That is for sure. And definitely in his mind, he's also trying to, from his understanding, probably protect Russian Federation militarily. And that doesn't mean that he's doing that in any moral sense. I think it's a pure calculation. Obviously, there's a long obsession with Ukraine. He stated to Bush Jr. in 2008 that there's no such country as Ukraine, and that's artificial. In 2022, in the 2021, in the summer before the invasion, 6 months before the invasion, he wrote an essay that about the unity of Ukrainian and Russian people, where he pretty much denied that Ukraine does exist. So as a separate state, obviously not as an ethnic group. So that is a very important point here. So this is ideological, this is philosophical, this is about his understanding of the security of the Russian state. This is about his legacy. This is about the power. This is about everything really for him.
Kirill, is there any part of you that says, because you gave some really important and pertinent details as to the reasons why, is there any part of the global stage, like, for example, the current US administration, is that presenting the US as did he basically take advantage of weaker policy and weaker leadership in the US and saw the opportunity and then said, okay, well, all of these things I've been feeling for this period of time and seeing and knowing, it's strike now while the iron's hot, or wait for another president to come in and potentially create problems?
Yeah. Do you mean we're talking about 2022 now, or we're talking about now?
Both.
Both.
So,
Okay.
but as part of the reason why is the current administration, not the incoming administration with Trump, is the current administration under Biden and Harris. Do you think that had anything to do with his motivation? Sort of like carpe diem. Now is the time to do this because the U.S. does not present itself as strong as it once was. Is that a militarily justified opinion, or does he not care about that? It's just now is the time, and he's made that decision.
I think I think there was an overall grand plan, right? But he is relatively flexible on the tactical level, and the decision the decision that he made on that specific day or that specific week or that specific month was related of his impression overall of the state of affairs. So I personally believe that that obviously the U.S. lost its capability as a deterrent. It doesn't mean, and because we need to understand, the deterrent is a psychological state, right? So you need to present the threat and you need to present the willingness to enforce whatever you're planning to enforce. And even if you have the technical capability or military capability, if you do not project strength, then the deterrent doesn't exist. So uh, everybody understands probably, and I don't even know if there's a discussion about that, the Afghanistan withdrawal of the United States projected a very bad picture.
Yeah.
Was it a part of the calculation? I'm not sure that it was a part of calculation, but was it a trigger that maybe triggered the event or at the higher speed? It's quite possible.
Okay. So, what do you think is going to happen when Trump takes office in the next few weeks? We're having this conversation in the middle of January of 2025. He's about to be inaugurated. He's made several public statements about how quickly he can end this conflict, which, for anything you want to say about Trump, love or hate him, or don't like what he says or how he operates, you can't deny the fact that he is an American patriot. He really does love his country. And if he says he's going to do something, it might take longer than he thinks, but he has in the past put his money where his mouth is, so to speak, and stepped up to fulfill something that politicians very rarely fulfill, which is a campaign promise. So what is your confidence level like, and how do you feel about his ability to end this conflict?
Well, I think the his ability to end this conflict is really high. And again, so we're talking about ending this stage of the conflict, right? The hot stage of the conflict.
Yeah.
Potentially, he would not be able to eliminate the conflict itself, but at least we can get out of this war. So what I think is, as you said, he promised it to end in 24 hours. He didn't really mean it. Everybody understand that was a figure of speech. Then the conversation was about 6 months. And now I think his envoy, if the reporting is correct, but that's the big question, if the reporting is correct, there's a deadline of May. So if the reporting is correct and the deadline is May, and that's already communicated via channels because the channels are open, that is a part of negotiation strategy. It's pretty much the deadline, and which could mean that this stage could be resolved this year. I think it's pretty high probability, and the reason why I think so is because I think fundamentally all the parties want to do that. Ukraine wants to achieve its goals, whatever the goals they decided they will be able to achieve at this stage. Putin obviously has this goal of subjugation of Ukraine. It didn't work in the military way, the way that it seems to be he was planning. So he might decide to move or fall back into his prime mode of operandi, which will be a political, and U.S. Is interested to finish this because not only Trump said so, but because it's definitely a risk for for further escalation.
What's your sense of why this has been able to go on to the anniversary that's coming up of 3 years? If you remember at the beginning, and again, whether the reporting is correct, we can debate that all the time. My guess is it's not entirely correct, but there were people that were saying, Russia's going to roll into Ukraine and just completely destroy it in a week or two. And now we're going on 3 years. Was that an accurate assessment at the time? And if it was, what has elongated this war by 3 years other than the US providing, all of the armament that they need?
Well, I would say that assessment obviously was wrong, right? Because it didn't happen. And the armaments came much later. The Battle of Kiev for Kiev was won by Ukrainians way before any significant military assistance was rendered. Yes, obviously their anti-tank weapons were handheld, were were delivered, and these things were very important. But we're not talking about tanks or artillery at that point of time. Really, all happened later. So I think there was a underestimate on the U.S. side of the Ukrainian capabilities, and the Russian capabilities were overestimated. And again, we need to understand. I think what my understanding is that a lot of these things, mistakes are happening because of the groupthink that exists in the um, intelligence community or military apparatus or military staff. Um, I'm sure there is many people, I'm not talking maybe about 10, 20%, 30% of people that did not agree with that assessment. But because of the groupthink and prevailing dogma, they decided either to not raise their voice or go along with the majority. So Ukrainians were underestimated. The Russians were overestimated. I think Zelensky all of a sudden became this Churchillian figure and decided that he doesn't need a ride and he needs ammunition, which obviously changed a lot because we know with the Second World War history, right? So Americans or anybody else step in to help people only if they're willing to fight. Because when the French surrendered, nobody helped them. And the Brits were helped because they bought time and they were willing to fight. And that was the reason. In this case, once Ukrainians start fighting and doing this extremely effective, then the Biden administration that wanted to support them really came along and started to do that. Specifically in the beginning of the war, I think it was very visible with the help in 2023, preparing for the summer offensive. But overall, the strategy that was deployed over the course of this years, and that's why the answer about why does it take so long, is because there was no clear strategy for the victory of Ukraine. There was a strategy of supporting Ukraine as long as it takes and avoiding any possibility of any serious escalation with Russia. Is that second part of the strategy wise or not? That's a different conversation because Russian being a nuclear power is a very important part of those calculations. Having said that, the first part, which is no path to victory clear and endless support, is not a good strategy because once you get into war, attrition doesn't necessarily mean that the Russia will win that war, but it will be just years of a bloody war.
Do you
That's
think,
what we're seeing right now, right?
of course, and do you think Putin's prepared for that, the longevity of that? If there's no path to victory, and this is just, I don't want to call it a stalemate, but if there's no opportunity for Russia to win, is he the type of individual that might back down, or is this He needs to get what he wants or what he thinks he wants first, and then there might be a temporary ceasefire or some other mechanism that might be put in place.
Right, but if his goal is subjugation of Ukraine or destruction of Ukraine, in case he doesn't cannot subjugate that, then long-term war, if he can sustain that, is a solution, isn't it?
Sure. Let me ask you a question because, again, this was reported that there was, I almost feel like NATO became a scapegoat for some of this communication because they said, or they made it appear as though Ukraine wanted to be part of NATO, and that would have screwed up Putin's long-term plans because he's not going to attack Ukraine if they're part of NATO. How much do you think NATO played in this uh, characterization?
Well, well, it's an interesting question, right, about the NATO overall. So let's start with the basics, right? So the basics is when Putin invaded Ukraine, he gave a speech in the morning, I think, early morning. There, what, 7 8 hours ahead of us. So the invasion happened between 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and I think there was a uh, urgent broadcast, something like 6 7 8 o'clock in the morning locally. So way ahead of us. And he said there's three goals that he's trying to achieve. That is denazification of Ukraine, it is demilitarization of Ukraine, and protection of the people of Donbass, which is what in the West referred as Russian-speaking Ukrainians. But actually, yeah, which is misnomer in itself because there's all kind of Ukrainians. They're Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking. A lot of them speak both languages, but it doesn't matter. So they're still Ukrainians. Um, Denazification of Ukraine, that's a very interesting thing, is because people are talking about, well, but there's no Nazis in Ukraine. So what he's talking about. So if you understand the mindset, is that and we lately heard, and we had a conversation that you just mentioned Trump, right? He was called fascist in the last 6 months several times. Fascist is just a bad word now. You just is a slur, right? It doesn't mean anything, except the fact that it does. But in this case, it doesn't. In the same way here, unification of Ukraine means that getting rid of the national government or nationalist government. And by nationalists, we're not talking about Nazis or fascists, or we're talking about the national Ukrainian government that says that Ukraine is a country, it's a separate nation, separate from Russia. And by his definition, that's Nazis. The second was the modernization of Ukraine. Obviously, if we're talking about domination of Ukraine that he's doing right now with Belarus or Belarus, then you can have an army. That army prevents or protects Ukrainian independence. It also protects the eastern part of Ukraine for further expansion of the Russian troops. And I'm talking about prior 2022. So that was the goal. And obviously, the last one was that enclave that they took. They wanted to protect it. I'm not sure that was one of those. I think it was a political move, more or less, because it's very popular at least that was popular in the Russian, within the Russian population on the Russian Federation side. And Crimea is obviously a very serious subject for Putin and for Russian Federation, period.
You mentioned just a few minutes ago that you are fairly confident that Trump will be able to end this war, and if the reports are correct, there's a target or a deadline or whatever it is. If if you believe that, what is that going to look like for both Russia and Ukraine? Because based on what you just said, Russia's goal was to basically and take over all of Ukraine. And I don't, this might be a Western view, and that's fine, but I'm not sure that's possible. What I kind of feel like is if there's going to be a negotiation, then there's going to be negotiated settlements or regions within Ukraine that Ukraine, there's going to have to be a compromise. Ukraine says, okay, we agree to stop the war and we will hand over this area. And this could be a very simplistic view. So please, take it with a
Mhm.
grain of salt. And Russia will say, okay, we agree to end the war if we get what we want, which is this group of territories or land in Ukraine and take over and have our own form of government, which is our government, and so on. What's your answer to that?
So the answer to your question, I do not know, right? It could go many different ways. It
Yeah.
could go in a way that South and North Korea went, which you have a stable, it's not a peace per se, right? But we have a stable line between the countries, heavily militarized, U.S. Forces sitting there, 30,000, I think. You have a very capable armies on the both sides of the border, and they coexist. It's not a pleasant coexistence, but it does. So it could happen like that. The question, obviously, you need to look at the map, right? If you look at the Korean Peninsula, it's a relatively small piece between the distance between, I guess, the east and the west of the country on that specific parallel. It's not that long. Here you have, I don't remember, is it 1,200 or 1,500 kilometer line, which is really hard to fortify, and I'm not sure how you're going to have the troops. So there's a lot of questions about that. The other question is Ukrainians and Russians need to agree. I mean, they need to agree before they go to negotiations, they need to agree what they want. And I don't think there is an agreement yet made within the political elites on both sides. And it's the harder for Ukrainians because they are a democratic country. They need to make that determination, and they need also to get the population on the side, right? With the Russians, it's much easier because it's an autocratic country, and population is going to get on the side once it's going to be resolved. So to give you the stats, I think the latest stats are 81% of the Russian population support the war, but it's not enthusiastic support. And this number doesn't change much. And I think 51% of the population wants peace at the same time. So these are the same people, right? So, which means it will be easier for Putin to persuade the population that, first of all, that the war stopped and he won, which is very important for his regime, and it will be hard for Ukrainians to do that. So Trump is an interesting figure in this case. So technically, Ukrainians could blame Trump. Well, everybody blames Trump anyhow, right? So that could be an interesting thing. The other important point here is that U.S. has the power to persuade both sides. Obviously, Ukraine is really dependent on U.S. for the weapons supply. Russia wants the other things like sanctions down and all these things, and Russians do not want escalation to nuclear war either. Who knows what's going to happen, right? Trump is really great with strategic ambiguity, so who knows what he's going to do, and that's worrisome in the calculations on the Russian side. So yeah, there's unique opportunities, I think. And we know that there are signals. Like I was listening to Lex Friedman's interview with Zelensky. It was very interesting to hear because a lot of people are saying, well, we need to persuade Zelensky to negotiate. In fact, Zelensky was talking that his condition for negotiations are that there will be deterrence and security guarantees. Well, if person's saying that they want security guarantees, it clearly means that he's open to negotiations. So, I mean, he's only even putting conditions on the table, right? The other side, obviously, is open to negotiations. Putin keeps saying that he is open. I'm not sure that that's we need to take that at the face value because it's very important for him to say that, because here on this continent, isolationists keep running with the Russian narratives all the time on the subject, right? He says that, everybody say, well, the bad guys, US and Ukrainians are the bad guys. They don't want to negotiate. He wants to. But, well, I believe he probably at this stage thinks that he can move out of this war. But again, and go into the long-term push towards subjugation of Ukraine and other means. But again, I don't know what he thinks, right? There's no way of knowing what he thinks. And this is a very interesting thing. I see this last 5-10 years. People tell what Trump thinks, and then they tell what Putin thinks, and I have no clue how people know that.
Sure.
What we can do, we can look what they do, right?
Yeah, we can look back in history. I mean, if we talk about Putin just for a second, I mean, he's been in power, I believe, since 1999, if I'm not mistaken. So we're 25 years of this, and if you just divide very simple math, 25 years by 4 years per president, even though some of them had a second term, he's lived through 4 or 5 or more U.S. presidents, and there has to be something of an ego attached with going through that number of people, because every time somebody shows up, he negotiates or doesn't negotiate something new, or he keeps things the way they are, and then he just waits it out, which is why I asked you at the very beginning, do you think the timing of this had anything to do with the current administration and their the way that they've shown weakness on the world stage, and how the U.S. presents itself? So when I think about that, then I start thinking about Zelensky and his historical background, and it brings me back to the who. Who are the players in this act and the characters that we're watching? Well, we're about to watch Trump take over, get inaugurated and take over the administration. Putin has been there for more than 25 years. And Zelensky is not really a veteran of the world leader game. And he's not really even, it reminds me a little bit of Trump in that he's not really a politician. He didn't start as, it's not like Joe Biden, who's been a career politician for 45 years. What do you think about Zelensky and the way that he's handled his country during this conflict? And do you think that he is an antagonist in this, or is he the victim? Because I find sometimes that I know that Russia invaded Ukraine. I understand that, and it's okay for him to say you shouldn't have done that. You're killing my citizens. But is he playing up to that, or do you think he is really this courageous leader that everybody sort of says that he is?
So, so it's a hard question. So let me try to kind of outline what I think, like in the sequence of events, right? He was elected on the promise of peace. Naively or not, meaning naively, the population naively thought about it, or maybe he was naive about it. But he thought there was the two Minsk Accords. And the Minsk Accords is another interesting subject here, because the Minsk Accords are what in business will be called a poison pill.
We're gonna get to that. If you want to talk about it now, let's do that, because there's something in those accords that is really twisting
Yes,
things.
correct.
Let's open that a bit.
So the Minsk Accords were signed, specifically the first one, where Russians were killing the Russian troops that were inside Ukraine unofficially, were killing Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine in the summer of 2020. No, sorry, in the summer of 2014 or 15, I was confused those years, in the first year. So just to give you the perspective, right? I've heard the tapes, and they are public, the tapes of the Security Council of Ukraine at the time when the Putin was taking over the Crimea, and they're in Russian. So it's really easy to understand. So there was a debate about what do they do? Do they push or they don't push? And the Minister of Defense or somebody of that caliber said that they do have 3,000 combat ready troops. That was it. 3,000 people. That was the Ukrainian army.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, the Ukrainian army was bigger, obviously, but as far as the combat ready, they were making estimates of 3,000. So that, and the Russian had 15,000 on the bases in Crimea, right? So decided not to defend. Again, this is for Ukrainians to decide what to do and what not to do, but that gives you a perspective. So when the war started in Donbass at the same time, the Ukrainians just didn't have forces that were ready. And there were a lot of volunteers, and I guess they were sending those 3,000 and more into the battlefield, and they were really fighting and dying. So the objective was to stop all that, at least somehow. So as part of that negotiation process, they arrived at some kind of a temporary peace treaty, and with a second one. But the problem with that is they were doing it under duress. And what they agree is they agree to autonomy of the eastern part of Ukraine. It sounds benign, but the way it is done is that all Ukrainian laws and parliament proceedings could be pretty much vetoed by the people in the East. And those people in the East were not politicians that were elected, even if they were, it's not a, they don't have, normally people don't have veto power of one region over the whole country. But a lot of them were really the Russian implants. So that was the poison pill. It was masterfully done by I guess the Moscow on that side, and everybody went along because people wanted just to stop war, right? I don't know what was Ukrainian motivation, probably stop war, and by time Europeans obviously at that point of time wanted to stop war and get to the business as usual. Why not? They needed oil and they needed gas, and they didn't like the killing and they didn't like the war. So they thought that was a solution, and they did it, right? And that is a very important understanding what Minsk Accords are. So when Zelensky came in, he was thinking that he can capitalize on these accords and create a permanent peace. I don't know why he thought that, but obviously he made all the efforts. And then over a period of time, he realized what it was and what is going to happen, and he stopped. He stopped doing what I guess Putin was expecting him to do. And my understanding, based on Lex's interview, that communication ceased. So they talked to them 100 times. They wanted to talk the 101st time, and then Putin stopped taking calls. Pretty much, that was it, right? I think he just at that point of time decided that he's not going to achieve what he wants to achieve that way. He's going to try another way.
Do you think the Minsk Accords were the precursor to where we are today? Meaning he tried something strategically. It was a brilliant move, right? That what he did in 2014 or 15, but he didn't get what you just said. He didn't get what he wanted, so he had to try it a different way, and this is by brute force, which he thought he was also going to succeed on and still hasn't. But how long? You and I have talked a few times now about the interview with Tucker Carlson.
Mm-hmm.
I That interview is fascinating for me because
It was fascinating for me too.
I was riveted, partially because in the beginning Putin kind of admonished Tucker and said, "Is this a real program or not?" You know, because Tucker's very giggly and U.S. and so on. And then Putin went into some really deep and rich history that nobody outside of probably yourself and most Western North American people had any idea about. And it was almost like it was the history that was he didn't say it was the justification. He was just giving a history lesson,
But
and
it wasn't it?
it ended up with, and then look what happened.
Yes, exactly.
So I've
So
watched that. I've watched it a few times now, and I was fascinated. And I thought, you're a history buff, so can you just share a little bit about what he was saying and how we got to, you don't have to go back hundreds of years unless you want to, but how did we get to this place where Putin is recalling, decades and decades worth of history? And
well, rather hundreds of years.
sure, sure.
It
Yeah,
started with eighth century, right? That would be like 1,200 years ago,
yeah, if my
I
math is
think.
correct, yeah.
Yeah. So look, I don't want to repeat what he did because he gave a lecture of 30 minutes, right? And we're going to lose the audience here, right?
So maybe just take out the tidbits and
Yeah.
chunk it.
Yeah, I think this is what I'm going to do. First of all, I'm going to tell that justification is irrelevant, really. We were going to go into the history, but justification is irrelevant because the way the world works after the Second World War is that nobody is allowed to take other territory by force. Because if you look at Europe in itself, you have Germans living in France, you have Germans living in Italy, you have Germans living in Czech, you have Hungarians living in Ukraine, you have Romanians living in Hungary, I don't know, but Hungarians definitely living in Romania. So the Balkans is just a powder keg that happened that led to the First World War. So if you start doing all that, we know what's going to end. Well, unless we want to go back into 1930s and then we're going to open this Pandora box and go into World War III in the serious note of trying to kill each other or they will try to kill each other because we're on a different continent here, that to change all those borders. So that is not a justification. It's irrelevant what happened before because the borders are the borders and the borders. Now let's talk about what he thinks and why he thinks it's justification. So the important thing that he talked about and I talked about was that essay that he wrote in 2021 in the summer about the historic unity of Ukrainian and Russian people. So what he was trying to do with his history lessons to explain that Russia, Ukraine is the same thing. So Ukraine is just several provinces of Russia that were artificially built in 1917. He has a big beef with Lenin on that subject. And then in 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it became an independent state. And Ukraine had part of the territory that is Russian, part of the territory that is Polish, all these jazz, right? So for listeners, I guess there's several important facts here to understand, and I will try to illustrate. Both Russians and Ukrainians are Eastern Slavs. There's also Belarus, right? Many, many years ago, 1,200 years ago, the Eastern Slavs were living in the Confederation of States that was called the Kiev Rus. The Kiev Rus has nothing to do with Ukraine and had nothing to do with Russia and nothing to do with Belarus. It's saying that the Russians and Kiev Rus or Ukrainian and Kiev Rus is the same thing as saying that Italians and Romans are the same thing. It's just ethnically the same people living in the same territory. And you might argue Italians at least speak kind of variation of Latin language. Ukrainians do not speak ancient Rus, and Russians don't speak ancient Rus, and Belarusians don't speak ancient Rus. That's a different language, slightly different territory, I guess, absolutely different culture, even religiously. I guess in the beginning there was orthodoxy in a couple of centuries, but it doesn't matter. So it's different people. So what Putin was trying to give all this history is to tell that it's the same people. And justification is if they are the same people, then they should be living in the same state. Because the whole idea of the nation states and historical mistake, that's a very Russian thing to say. So there's a historical mistake or mistake made by history, we're going to correct it, right? So that's why I guess what I'm trying to say is, first of all, I believe it's important to understand it's quite irrelevant because the Second World War happened, and after that we decided collectively to live the way Europeans decided to live the way they decided to live without changing the borders. And the fact that the Russian and Ukrainian people is one and the same is also absolutely bogus. There is, I want to illustrate, just to give an example. He keeps saying Russia and refer to 8th or 9th century. So the Russia as a state or as the name of the state starts to appear around Peter the Great, and after Peter the Great becoming the Russian Empire, which is 800 years later. Um, so, and when people refer to Russia today, it's a Russian Federation. It's not the Russia, it's not the Imperial Russia. Maybe territory is approximately the same, approximately, but it's not exactly the same. But again, it's a very different state. It's very different. It's just completely different.
Do you think that what he was talking about, like, do you think he knows, um, this maybe is not a fair question, but do you think he realizes that nobody in the Western culture knows anything about what he even said from a historical perspective, unless you've studied it and you're really into it, like obviously you are? Do you think he was just playing? Do you think that it led to him justifying what he did? Because he never actually came out and said, I did this because he just went through all of this historical stuff that not many people really know about. So what is your guess on the strategy there? Did he really know what he was doing?
So as I said before, I don't know what is in his head, right? I just don't know what he knows. I know that there's no downside for him of doing it, except obviously being too long-winded and people losing him after 10 minutes. But there's no downside. So he talked to the Russian audience. Russian audience understand the basic concepts or majority of what he was saying, because what he was, despite of what Tucker Carlson was saying, he is a deep knowledge of history. That was slight around ninth, 10th grade history lesson. That was not very deep. And correlation is not accusation. He confused several things. The narrative, the dates were mixed up. The whole theory was mixed up. The way that nations were formed, all of that was designed to fit a certain narrative, which is the narrative in his head. I don't know, does he believe it or he's using it for internal audience? Definitely he's using it for Western audiences because there's a whole bunch of people running around as, again, just repeating these things. So the way I would look at it, and I keep looking at it myself, is there any downside of saying this? If there's no downside, only upside, why wouldn't he say that, right? What he really thinks and what he really believes, I don't know.
So why do you think then he would entertain an interview with Tucker Carlson if what he's saying is um, there's no downside to what he's saying? Is that the answer? Do you think? If it's
Yes,
downside to what I'm saying, sure, come in and interview me and I'll tell you whatever you want to
yes.
hear.
And if he would have not done this 30-minute history lecture that was 45 minutes, it would be an extremely successful interview.
Yeah.
Because he was communicating everything he wanted to communicating. He was talking about NATO, I guess, and all other things, right? He was repeating the same messages that they're repeating in the last 3 or 4 years. And he was repeating it for the global audience, and he was repeating for the Tucker Carlson audience, which tend to trust Tucker Carlson, and by, I guess, transitionally, they trust the source that he's interviewing.
Do you think that Putin, the way he's been portrayed in the Western media, do you think it's a fair characterization that he's a world leader and he's an antagonist and he's a communist and a socialist and all the words that people would use to describe him, and he's this horrible, evil person that represents a country that is terrible and all of the things that people have been told. Do you feel that way?
Well, but I think we already touched a little bit when I said that Trump is being called fascist, right, all the time. I mean, people call people all kind of words here. I think we need to look at what he's done. Well, he invaded the country, which he called a brotherly country with a brotherly people, and killing them for the last 3 years. Is that evil? Absolutely. Is he trying to do what Hitler tried to do by eliminating complete people physically? Of course not, right? It doesn't mean that, let's say, there will be a Russian occupation. It doesn't mean that 10 or 50 or 100,000 Ukrainians would not be killed. Of course, that would have happened because there will be a resistance, there will be insurgency, there will be roundups, and all kind of stuff would have been happening. Will he try to eliminate Ukrainians as people? Culturally, probably. Physically, unlikely. So it depends on where you draw the line about evil. Is he a communist? Absolutely not. I mean, he's very open about it. He doesn't. I told you he has a beef with Lenin, right? Because he created Ukraine, according to him. So is he trying to restore the Russian Empire? I mean, he's not trying to take over Finland or take over Poland, so which was part of the Russian Empire. I don't think so. He's not.
Well, let's talk about that for a second because there's been some speculation over the last 3 years with this war that when he gets what he wants from Ukraine, assuming he gets what he wants, that he's not going to stop there. That there is, and you touched on this at the beginning of this call, where you said, is he trying to rebuild the USSR? No, but is he going to, do you think he has plans to expand? And this is just speculation. So the problem with speculation is we can talk for hours and nobody knows.
Mhm.
But I'm just really curious, is it going to stop with Ukraine or is it going to, I think the big fear for a lot of people that understand the world stage and NATO, the
Mhm.
problem is if he attacks a NATO country, that is going to trigger a response, a very heavy response from a lot of the NATO. Well, it has to. That's part of the
Well, but that's what you just pretty much said. It has to, right? I
yeah.
mean, it will trigger. It has to. Is it will it trigger or it has to? So
Well, it's Article 5 of the NATO treaty
right.
that you
So
attack
that
one, you attack all of us.
right now the question is depends where we will be, right? Let's say if the West wouldn't support Ukraine, then think about from the rational perspective. Could have he thought that if he would have taken Ukraine, right, and there will be no support, could have he thought that if he takes the next country, let's say one of the smaller Baltic states, that there will be no response? Could he thought that? Could he? Of course he could, right? Do we know that he would have thought that? No, we don't. But if you don't have deterrent,
Yeah.
which is with a credible threat, then who knows what people will think. So the reason why I'm saying he doesn't want to put together back the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire in the whole territory is because he has a very easy option militarily. He could have went to the Central Asian republics, right? But he
Yeah.
doesn't want to. Otherwise, he would have, because it would be easier expedition compared to Ukraine. But the reason why he doesn't want to probably is because there's no upside. It's pure downside. Ukrainian in his mind was an upside.
Well, let's talk about that for a second because you just mentioned China. What do you think the relationship is like between Russia and China? And what we're hearing in the West is that they're what's the cliche, strange bedfellows or something where, they are allied in some way, but we're not exactly sure what it is, but it's scaring people because you
Yeah.
have really huge two superpowers, and if they're in any way on common ground on things, that means they're negotiating other things in the background that we may be unaware of.
So we should be concerned, right? So, first of all, again, again, I don't know what's in their heads. They seem to have a good personal relationship, but again, people die, right? And states still endure. So the question is, will that endure? They obviously, it looks like a marriage of convenience with a good personal relationships. But think about what's the upside for both countries and compared to what was before. If you look at 30s and you look how the Second World War started, you had Axis, right? You had Italy, you had Germany, and you had Japan, and then you have allies. So these countries were allies between each other, but they were never coordinating troops. There were no armaments movements. There were no supply of weapons happening. None of that was happening. There was a lot of political posturing, but I didn't hear that Japan was sending tanks to Germany or Germany was sending tanks to or artillery to Japan and vice versa on the mass scale. Italians were, I guess, supporting the German troops. They sent, I think, one division to Russia, and majority of them froze to death in Stalingrad that winter. And that was pretty much it, I think, as far as on the Eastern Front. Obviously, they were probably doing more in Europe, but again, it was not significant. So right now, you do have countries like you have North Korea sending soldiers fighting with the Ukrainians right now. They were sending artillery shells, artillery systems, I believe, but shells in millions. The Iranians sending drones. Russia's supplying, as report says, certain ballistic missile capability or knowledge. So there's a cooperation happening. And obviously, we don't know what's happening between Russia and China because China seems to be not shipping weapons. Could they? Well, it all depends on where Chinese stand because Chinese have massive trade with Europe and the US still, right?
Yeah.
So on one side, the cooperation between these countries are deeper versus between Italy, Germany, and Japan before or during the Second World War. On the political front, obviously, it's not that deep as it was because ideologically these are different countries. The only thing I think, the only thing that puts them together is they're not happy with the current world order, and they're trying to append it. And even that's why maybe China is very careful, is because I don't think they want to append it completely. They want to make an adjustment. Iran obviously wants to append it. That's a different story altogether.
That's an interesting word to use about changing the world order. We're just going to adjust things by demolishing an entire country.
Yeah.
Well, we've heard about the one China policy. Now we're hearing with this new administration in the U.S. first policy. I get the sense that Putin probably has his own some sort of Russia first policy. What I kind of get the feeling with what we're seeing in the world now is these countries are really internalizing, themselves, meaning yes, they would like to maybe engage with other countries, but at the moment, there's too much of that going on that's diluting currency and imports and exports. And China has just flooded the world with products and services and that sort of thing. I'm curious, just as we get into this next administration, when Trump basically puts an elastic band, a giant elastic band around the U.S. and says, nothing's coming in unless you pay, and nothing's going out unless you pay. And I'm wondering how economically what kind of effect Trump is going to have on Russia. And it's not just sanctions, because Russia is supplying, I don't know the percentage, so forgive me, but they're supplying a significant amount of oil and natural gas to many of the European NATO countries.
Not gas anymore.
So that's been cut off.
Yes, correct.
Okay. So, you can hurt an economy by no longer buying something that you need if you can get it from another supplier. So I'm assuming that's going to be part of the negotiations and, how maybe Trump can figure out a way to navigate a deal where there is some kind of compromise between Ukraine and Russia. How do you feel about
Right, and that was a conversation in the beginning. What you asked me, could Trump play a significant role here? And my answer was he has a major leverage over Ukraine because of their supplying weapons, but they also have a major leverage over Russia because they can put screws in. So they obviously cannot destroy the country economically, at least not fast, right? If they can destroy it, maybe it will take several years. But again, what destruction means is a different. Like it's if we're talking about -3% GDP, that's a destruction. That's what Russians, they don't feel that's a destruction at all. They feel it's like hardship. That's different versus destruction. Right. But he can do some damage with it, sanctions and the oil tankers and the financial third-party sanctions, because the most important thing here, I guess, is the fact that the decoupling of the Chinese and U.S. economy idea had an effect. My understanding is the trade size of the trade changed quite dramatically over the course of the last several years. And China's exports into U.S. are not as high as they were. Well, China exports in Russia are high. Again, it's a small market compared to U.S. It's a very small market compared to the United States. But the leverage is decreasing. The question is, if this continues for a long time, let's say 4 or 5 years, and we're not only talking about how many people will die and the risk of escalation, but also the economic consequences of all that, right? And the time will not necessarily be on U.S. side, but it would not be on the Russian side either.
it? Did you say earlier in our talk that there's a large majority or a majority of Russians who support the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's around 80% support the war in Ukraine.
Are you surprised by that number?
No.
And why do you think that group, well, I mean, we don't know for sure if that's the right number, but let's say it's around 80%. That's the majority of Russians. What is it about the war in Ukraine that they support?
Right, and that's first of all, we need to talk about definition of what the word support means, right? I also said that 51% of the Russians, and obviously if 81% or 80% support the war, 51% of the Russians want peace, these are the same people, right? It's not like 20 and 20, they are separate. It's the same people. So, and that 51% is the latest number, so majority now support peace. And that's why partly it's easier for Putin to sell this thing. So support of war means lukewarm support. It's more like they're conforming to what state is saying, and also the information flow. There's a massive propaganda. They're doing really, really well. 80% of people receive the information through their TV sets, and 3 or 4, 5 major state channels, and it's a pretty much propaganda. Everything is 24/7, right? They don't have alternative information. There was a conversation in the beginning. There's a lot of mixed marriages because of the border, and Ukrainian and Russians were living in the same country, which was USSR. There's a lot of Ukrainians and Russian families and Russians and Ukrainian families. But a lot of those connections were broken. People don't talk to each other. A lot of people, I'm not saying all, but a lot of people. So you have state propaganda saying stuff. You have break of personal communications, and there's war, right? And majority of Russians don't want to talk about it, meaning they just don't. It exists in a different dimension,
Right.
different universe.
Sure. If the survey is, do you support the war or you don't, it's neither here nor there for some people. They might just say, yeah, I do, and I'll move on and don't ask
Yeah,
me. Of
because it's a patriotic thing to do, right?
course, yeah. I recently watched an interview with Putin because Biden apparently approved uh, long-range missiles for Ukraine. And I watched an interview with Putin. It was a short clip, but he basically said, once you get into a protracted war like this, Kirill, you get to a point where you're just fighting every day, but nothing is really changing. It's just we shoot you and you shoot us. And I know that's an oversimplification of it, but nothing is really changing. No one's really talking about it much anymore. You don't really get a lot of updates on the news like we used to of every day something else is blown up. But Putin was talking about how the use of long range missiles that would enter Russian territory that are supplied by the US would be an obvious provocation, and Russia would have to respond to that. Now, I find that statement to be interesting in that he's the one that started that started this. So if Ukraine suddenly has firepower that they weren't in possession of before, I'm curious to know how you feel about that. And do you think that was just Joe Biden posturing, on his way out the door and saying, we're going to approve this and, let's see what happens, sort of thing, which is obviously a very harmful and irresponsible thing to do. But I'm curious about whether or not it was real.
Look,
Which,
so
which of course we don't know because we can't get inside their heads, but I am curious about how you feel about that.
so we do have this de-escalation escalation management approach, but which is personified by Jack Sullivan, right? Jake Sullivan, um, which manages this whole thing, I guess, by himself, really. Um, and he's probably is the go-to guy to make those decisions or provide president with advice on those decisions. What we saw over the course of the years is the Ukrainians were asking for certain things, and they get them. They get them 6 months late, not in the quantities they want, not in the specs they want, but they got them. They were asking for this long range missiles for, I don't know, a year and a half. So they got some of it. So I think that's the logic. So they get some of it. US supplies it, looks how Russians react. Putin says something. Fundamentally, nothing changes. You go on with the next weapon system. That's pretty much it, I think.
I'll be
There
very,
was interesting, by the way. I was listening to several clips and looking at the several clips. He obviously was giving an interview in Russian. There was all kind of comments in English as of nuclear escalation, and Tucker Carlson was on this thing too all the time. And he's very careful what he says. Like they was saying, I think Tucker said or somebody said on his following that, well, this could trigger nuclear war because Putin said that's a NATO attack on the Russian Federation's soil, which in fact that's not what he said at all. He said that according to his information that he has, and many experts believe, it's the same thing. Many people are saying that the Ukrainians are capable of operating their systems. That means that there are U.S. or British officers sitting at the control panels of these rockets that are firing in the Russian territory. By de facto, NATO troops are engaging with the Russians, and that will have consequences. That's what he said. What does it mean? It might mean nothing, really, because he didn't say that they're going to target and kill those people. He implied that they're trying to kill the systems, but
do you think that there's a difference between US provided weapons? Like it's really obvious that's world news. There's a difference between US providing weapons versus US having troops on the ground in Ukraine, which obviously there are. They're hiding them, if you want to call it.
that I don't know. I have no way of knowing what does it mean. Do they have instructors training infantry somewhere in the Western Ukraine. I don't know. Maybe
That's what
yes,
I've
maybe
heard. And again, I don't know either, but that's what I've heard.
yeah. I've heard too, but I have no way of knowing. And by the way, yeah, think about why would Putin will care? Because they could be training Ukrainians, which they do, on the Polish territory, right? Like 100 kilometers, just 100 kilometers, 50 kilometers west of that border versus 50 kilometers east of that border. And that's like 2 hour flight to the east of the country. Right? I'm maybe exaggerating. Maybe it's hour 50 minutes. That's a long distance. Does it matter? No, it does not. So, so are there American troops fighting on the in the east? Obviously not. Right? There's no infantry. It's like there's no paratroopers. There are no American tanks rolling with American service members. Nothing like that is happening. Right? So there's not even instructors per se that are operating there, right?
Well, I remember the story about the jets, the fighter jets that were supposed to be donated, if you will. I think it was from Finland, if I'm not mistaken, that the jets were coming from, but that didn't really happen the way it was supposed to happen because there wasn't enough time for the Ukrainians to get trained on the jets that were supposed to come. And then there was some, and then I lost track of the information train because
They got a certain number of F-16s, right?
did they?
But yeah, but it's the same story, right?
Yeah.
Um, 6 months late, like 10 units short, something like that, right? Sure.
And that's not a small amount. 10 F-16s can really do
No,
something.
no, no, but it was a figure of speech. I don't know how many
Okay.
it was, right? I don't know how many they got, but we're not talking about hundreds, right?
Yeah. Kirill, I wanted to ask you, you obviously have lived in Russia. How has Russia changed from what you remember it to be from your childhood and what you see it as today?
Right. So I lived in without living my house where I lived. I lived in two different countries. I started living in the Soviet Union, then I was living in the Russian Federation, which were two different countries. And then Russian Federation in the 90s, and then I left the country. But what happened in 2000, that was the same country with the same name, but absolutely different political climate. And even later, it became not only political climate, but also the state structure changed. There was a new constitution adopted, but even before the new constitution, they passed a lot of laws changing the way elections were done. The legislature was different. The reciting of the rules were different. The president power became different. So it's really the way to look at it is probably like looking at the French, right? The Fifth Republic, the Fourth Republic, the Third Republic, the same French state, but they're relatively different. Except the French culture is stays the same, and here the whole political culture changed quite dramatically.
Do you think Putin, as a leader in a position where he's been in power for this long, do you think he's misunderstood? Or do you think whatever we see and whatever we are hearing is exactly who this person is?
I think I think there's probably understanding who he is among people who deal with him on a political level, states, heads of states. I think they pretty much understand by now. But in the popular culture, I think there's a lot of myths. I mean, he's 25 years in power, right? Crazy. This is a mythical creature, right? Really.
Yeah. No, that's why I was saying earlier. I think there's got to be some ego involved here
Mhm.
with him. And you said he's not a young man, so there may be some kind of legacy or something he's thinking about for the future. What if I'm not here for the next 25 years? Because obviously unlikely that he would be. But I'm just curious about, when things in the world change like this, when one country invades another country, there's motivation behind uh, there has to be motivation behind why they do that. They're not doing it for, shits and giggles. This is this is serious stuff. They're killing people and they're trying to accomplish some kind of goal. And it seems to me that, based on what you said earlier, maybe that's why he's doing it now. Maybe that is the motivation. Maybe there is a legacy that he's trying to leave. And, he wants his name written somewhere on some monument to his great achievement. What do you think
Yeah,
about
I think you're right. I think the legacy plays a significant role. I think if we go back to original question that I guess we didn't elaborate, think about this way. You have several motivations, right? You have personal motivation that we talked about right now. We do have a state interest. We do have um, dissolution of USSR in 1991 created this new state that needed to be put together over a period of time. So there's interest of the states. There's also European architecture that were put in the 90s with inclusion of Russia into certain European security structures. And I guess the Russian military, maybe intelligence elite, him definitely, were not happy with what they end up having in roughly maybe 2004, 2006. And then they made the strategic move that they're not happy and made a strategic move to change that. And that was announced in Munich Security Conference in 2008. This is very old news. It started in 2008 publicly with his speech, really, where he pretty much told that he's going to do the strategic pivot from where they are to what they want to be, but he didn't say what they want to be, because I think he didn't quite, maybe he didn't want to articulate, maybe he didn't saw completely the vision at that point of time, but they were not happy where they are. So it could be from the great power perspective, because one of the things that is important to understand is Russia has certain aspirations, right? They consider themselves to be a great power, and they want to continue to be the great power. The aspirations are way ahead of their capabilities. So it didn't deter them many times before. It doesn't seem to be deterring them now. So they're going to continue to try to play this great power game. The question would be able to, and how we end up being. I think we should not be particularly concerned about it. I think we should be concerned how to finish what's in front of us, which is this war, and finish it so Ukraine can survive and can continue to be an independent state. And then after that, it's not about also winning the war, it's about winning the peace, right? How to make Ukraine prosperous. Obviously, Ukrainians are the people who are going to do that, but I guess it's in our interest to help them.
Of course, yeah. What is something that people know or think they know about Russia that is absolutely true to the core? And what is something that has been falsified in the worldview of Russia from your perspective?
Well, you just said some people say he's a communist, Putin, or the Russians are the new communists, and that's not true. Absolutely not. Um, does Russia look at the territory in a different way? Is it imperial mindset as the territory is very important? If you will consider it to be a part of the imperial mindset, that's definitely true. The territory, the whole Russian ethos is based on putting together the territory, right? Because when Putin was giving this whole lecture about history, as I said, there was a confederation of states, which was Kiev Rus, and it disintegrated. It disintegrated when Mongols arrived. I mean, it was not necessarily because of Mongols. It was on the last leg anyhow at that point of time, and it disintegrated. And what happened is there were two nucleuses. One was Ukrainian nucleus, the other one is Russian, and the Russian was more aggressive, more successful, and it was acquiring the territories back first, right? Um, and again, some people say some of this was acquisition, not the back, but it was acquisition of territories that didn't belong before, and that's true. It's the imperial conquest is an imperial conquest, right? But certain territories that they acquired were Russian territory before. And again, when I say Russian, I didn't mean in the Russian Federation or even Russian. I'm talking about East Slavic territories that were taken away by neighboring countries. Um, so this whole acquisition of land and land as something sacred is part of the Russian ethics.
Interesting. The
That's why I was concerned about Arctic from Canadian perspective 15 years ago,
yes.
because the Russians were exploring under the sea, blowing up, trying to prove that the ridge that starts on their land continues into Canadian land, and therefore if it continues under the sea, it's part of their territory. That was scary for me, because once it gets into their head, it becomes a problem.
Well, let's expand on that a little bit because Trump has started talking, and some people are like, "What? What? This guy is out of his mind. He's talking about buying Greenland."
Mm-hmm.
He says strategically, it's for national security. And people, I think, sometimes he says outlandish things, and you just go, "Okay, it's Trump." But he was talking about this even when he was in office before. It just it didn't come to fruition, and it didn't become a big thing. He's already saying that now. And the concern that they're expressing is, I guess, along the same lines as something that you just said, but that China and Russia are in that region all the time, and they pose a significant security threat based on the location of Greenland to North America. How do you what do you think about all of that?
I think Trump is just anchoring and negotiating,
Right.
right? I mean, he doesn't mind. Like I was just listening the other day. People were saying, well, he's not a successful businessman because he had 6 bankruptcies, right? Uh, Despite the fact he's a billionaire, it seems like he doesn't mind. He just throws stuff at the wall and see what sticks. It seems like his modus operandi.
Yeah.
So he's anchoring this, anchoring that. Canada 51st state. That was funny.
Oh, I love that one. That I was laughing at
Yeah,
that, calling Justin Trudeau Governor Trudeau.
yeah, that was cool. I thought that was like, and Gretzky will be the next governor. That was amazing. Like we're going to
Fun to watch.
that's hockey rivalry on the next level.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I love when he makes comments like that because it prompts other world leaders to respond. So Denmark, who owns
Great.
Greenland, was like, no, 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 Greenland's not for sale. There's no sign on the lawn that says Greenland is for sale. And Trump is like, I don't care, I'm buying it anyway. Like,
Exactly. And this is the funniest thing, right? So nobody wanted to negotiate with him on the Greenland, but when he anchors it, all of a sudden people start talking.
yeah,
So by default, they're engaging in negotiations.
yes.
So it's just a beautiful tactics and strategy. Well, yesterday they were asking the new incoming minister of defense and U.S. Secretary of Defense in the United States, right? Are you going to help Trump to invade Greenland? It was so funny, and he said, "Well, Trump is good on doing the strategic ambiguity thing." And then the senator, obviously the Democrat, said, "Oh, so you're going to help him to invade Greenland?" So he didn't say that. Trump never said he's going to invade. But again, when people are, and sometimes I seriously, like I was looking at that and I thought, is she serious? She thinks that way, or it's just all games, right? So
I think a large portion of it is just games. They're trying to cast some shadow of ambiguity over, his qualifications and making him seem like he's not the hero that everyone thinks he is, and he's going to do a terrible job. And
that's the answer to the question. Is it strategic for the U.S.? Yeah, they have a military base there. Are going to take this over? Military, obviously, of course not. So would they want it to be some kind of overseas territory? Maybe. Well, But again, it's not strategic. Strategic is they maintain the base. And strategic is Europeans spend more on defense. So Americans spend on defense less. So by doing all these things, he's achieving that because Denmark all of a sudden said they're going to spend more on defense on Greenland, didn't they?
Yes.
Well, here you go. I mean, if he would have asked them nicely, they would have said no.
Yeah.
And now they're going to spend more on defense on Greenland. So they will put more troops or whatever. You think Danish officers will be preparing for an invasion from the United States? Of course not. They're crazy.
Well, you never know, but I do think that one's solid. So, Kirill, we've talked about a lot today. I've asked you a lot of questions. You've been really great with all of the information. Is there a question that you were hoping that we were going to talk about, or a topic that you were hoping we were going to talk about that we haven't covered?
So what I want to, yeah. So what I want to emphasize, there's several things, right? So this is obviously the first podcast that I not podcast, this first interview that I'm doing, and I have a lot of thoughts, and a lot of them are in writing on my Substack that you probably want to put in the link. And there's more meat with the facts to the things that I said. Um, One thing that I want people to take away is that you should not dismiss what Putin says, because Putin says things for a reason. It's not random, right? He either says them to persuade you in a certain way, and he could be lying, and he could be conveying that information to confuse you, but in a certain way that he wants, or he's telling the truth. Like, give you an example. He said they are trying to achieve three objectives when invading Ukraine: denazification, which is get rid of national government or nationalist government. And again, nationalist government means Ukrainian government that believe Ukrainian are different people. These are who the Nazis. It's like the same way as we're Canadian Nazis because we believe Canadians are Canadians, right? Not Americans. So that's that. Then obviously the Ukrainian military demilitarization and to help the people in the eastern Ukraine. He never said that NATO is the fourth objective. That NATO was not on that objective. It could be a concurring objective, but it's not one of the three. So, and then NATO came about in the conversations later. I'm not saying that NATO is not a concern for Russia. It is, specifically now, but I'm not saying it's not a concern for Russia. What I'm saying is it was not one of the major reasons for invasion. So therefore, when you look what he's saying, you need to really look what he's saying. So because people say, "Oh, just dismiss what he's saying." No, he wrote an essay 6 months before the invasion. A year before the invasion, they did tactical games. Well, it's not games. They have 160,000 troops, pretty much the same troops a year before that, but they didn't go in. I don't know why. Obviously, it will be interesting 20 years from now, interesting to see why they didn't do that at that point of time. Maybe Afghanistan was a trigger. Maybe the timing was a trigger. Maybe Ukrainians were building capable forces and they decided that over a period of time, the forces become more capable. Therefore, it's time now, right? So, but dismissing him is a bad idea.
So what you're saying is basically that we should listen carefully to what he's saying because he is deliberate in his message. Whether it's true or not, we can't decide that yet. But
right,
he's deliberate in why he says what he says and when he says it.
Correct.
And unlike some of the Western politicians who they're talking out of both sides of their mouth and you can't believe a single thing that they're saying, which I think is what people feel is refreshing about Trump, because when he says he's going to do something, he really does do it. And, he's not
necessarily to the full scale that he's saying.
No, but he does, sure. So if it takes, until May, for example, to to negotiate some kind of peace
By the
agreement.
way, I didn't mean that. I didn't say that's what's going to happen. I said, based on the reporting, it seems they're setting up this internal goal as the deadline for negotiations, at
Yeah,
least communicating that, right?
but at the very least, let's pretend it was May. Let's pretend it was the end of next year. If he is successful in accomplishing a peace treaty between the two countries, that is exactly what he said he was going to do. Yeah, he didn't do it in 24 hours. That was absurd. I'm not sure anyone believed that, but if they did, that's fine. But if he,
By the way, let me interrupt you here. So this is also a very interesting point. So this whole disarmament thing between between USSR and the United States, like Reagan Gorbachev thing, right? Uh, how long did it take them to reach conceptually the agreement to limit and then disarm? Any idea how long did it take them?
my no, but my recollection, it was years. Like
2.5 days in principle.
I, okay, in principle,
In principle,
yeah,
in Reykjavik, on the ship, in the ocean. 2.5 days, right? So when you talk about 24 hours, in principle, maybe when they put stuff on the table, they might reach, in principle, the framework agreement, maybe not 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, 72 hours. Then they need to nail down all the details. It might take 4 or 6 months, right?
yeah.
But the idea could be achieved pretty fast, or it could be achieved again pretty fast on the second stage, on the third stage, because the framework is the framework, right?
Right. Well, that's great, Kirill. We've been talking for a while. This has been an enlightening interview with you. I really appreciate your time, and I think, like we've already talked about, let's explore this further and go even deeper if we can into, trying to understand what's going on in the world and try to make sense of it. Because
Yeah, yeah. But thank you, John, and I'm very hopeful with 2025, with incoming administration trying to help Ukrainians to fix all this.
right. Well, let's hope that happens.